Jack Harlan walked into his daughter's school cafeteria, expecting to surprise her with lunch. What he found instead would change everything. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was on her knees, picking food off the cold floor with trembling hands. A boy stood over her, laughing. A teacher watched from 10 FT away, arms crossed, doing absolutely nothing. Jack didn't yell. He didn't charge. He just stared. Because in that moment, a father's worst nightmare became real, and a promise he made to his dying wife shattered in front of him. What happened next brought 200 desert vipers to that school's front steps. But they didn't come for revenge. They came for something the town never expected. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. It was a cafeteria that smelled of industrial cleaner and overcooked spaghetti. The kind of place where noise and fluorescent light conspired to make everything feel both small and permanent. The lunch rush had ended. Most of the children were already back in class, but in a corner near the emergency exit, a scene was unfolding that no child should ever have to face. Lily Harlan, 7 years old, with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, was on her knees. Her pink lunch tray lay upside down against the wall, its contents scattered. A bruised apple, a crushed sandwich, a carton of milk spreading white rivers across the tile. Standing over her was Tyler Grant, 12 years old, broad-shouldered, smirking like someone who thought cruelty a kind of talent. "You people don't deserve real food," he said. "Pick it up. That's what you're good at." Lily didn't answer. She had learned the economy of silence, how it could make danger pass for peace. She reached for a soggy piece of bread, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold it. 10 F'd away, Mrs. Karen Ellis, the cafeteria supervisor, stood with her arms crossed. She watched. She waited. She said nothing. The door swung open and Jack Harlan pushed through. He was 44, 6'2", with a salt and pepper beard and a leather vest that announced his allegiance. Desert Vipers, New Mexico chapter. He'd come to surprise his daughter with a grilled cheese from the diner on Route 66. The kind of small comfort ordinary families keep for one another. The sandwich slipped from his hands when he saw her. His body tightened. Every fiber demanded something fierce and immediate. He imagined crossing the room, seizing Tyler by the collar, the quick physics of punishment. But Lily looked up. Relief was not there. There was shame, the kind that makes a child look as if she is the one who's been found wanting. "Daddy," she whispered, "he keeps doing this. He kicked my tray again. Again!" The words struck him like a bullet. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Ellis. Her arms uncrossed, her posture went brittle. "Mr. Harlan," she said, voice thinly calm. "Children will be children. Lily needs to learn to stand up for herself." "How long?" Jack interrupted. "Excuse me, how long has this been happening?" Mrs. Ellis's silence answered more plainly than any confession. Jack did not shout. He did not threaten. He knelt beside Lily and began to help her pick up the food. "It's okay, baby girl," he murmured. "I'm here now, and this is never ever going to happen again." He meant it, and he did not yet know how large that promise would have to be. Now, you might be thinking, a desert viper finds his daughter humiliated, and his first move is to help her pick up food. That is not the story you expected, is it? What Jack understood, though, was this. Brute force might satisfy in the moment, but it would not change the thing that hurt her. To truly protect Lily, he would need something far more powerful than fists. He would need the truth. And the truth, as he was about to discover, ran deeper than a single bully and one complacent teacher. Before the cafeteria, before the scattered lunch tray and the trembling hands of a little girl trying to make herself small, there was another life, a quieter one, warmer, shaped by desert light and the steady hum of motorcycles. 2 years earlier, Jack Harlan lived in Reno, Nevada, with his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Lily. It was an ordinary life in the way that the most precious ones are. A small home, a familiar neighborhood, routines built on love rather than luxury. Sarah had once been a nurse, but she traded the frantic rhythm of hospital corridors for the soft glow of a bakery kitchen, opening a small shop that smelled always of cinnamon and cardamom. Jack ran a motorcycle repair shop, working shoulder to shoulder with the Nevada chapter of the Desert Vipers, a brotherhood he'd ridden with for 15 years. They weren't wealthy, not by any stretch, but happiness came easily to them. Lily grew up surrounded by leather-clad uncles who treated her like royalty, lifting her onto their shoulders and calling her princess, teaching her to pedal her tricycle in formation as if she were part of the pack. She laughed, often loudly, filling rooms with a brightness that seemed impossible to dim. And she was stubborn in the most endearing way, determined, bold, unmistakably her parents' daughter. Then Sarah started coughing. At first it was nothing. A winter cold. They thought a bit of desert air dryness. But coughs became fits. Fits became exhaustion. Tests were run. And then came the words that hollow out a family in an instant. Stage 4 lung cancer. She had never smoked a day in her life. The doctors gave her 8 months. She lasted 6. On the night she died. The house was quiet, except for the sound of her struggling breaths and the soft hum of machines that offered no hope. She held Jack's hand, her grip weak but urgent, and she made him promise one thing. Protect her. Whatever it takes. She's going to need you to be her everything now. Jack had never broken a promise to his wife. He wasn't about to start. After the funeral, Nevada became too heavy to breathe in. Every street corner carried a memory. Every room reminded him of what he'd lost. His brothers in the New Mexico chapter saw the toll and offered him something simple, but life-saving. A fresh start. A position helping run the chapter's legitimate businesses, diners, distribution routes, honest work grounded in community. Jack accepted. He packed their lives into a truck, buckled Lily into the passenger seat, and headed south toward a sunrise he hoped would hurt a little less. But grief doesn't disappear. It only changes shape. In New Mexico, Lily, once sunlight and sneakers, grew quiet. She stopped asking for friends to come over. She picked half-heartedly at her meals. She walked with her shoulders curled inward, as if bracing for something unseen. Jack told himself it was normal, a move, a loss, an adjustment. He believed she would settle with time. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that Lily was fighting a battle every single day at Oakwood Elementary, a battle she believed she had to face alone. Here's what I need you to understand. Lily didn't tell her father because she didn't want to burden him. She had just watched him lose his wife. She thought she was protecting him. And if that breaks your heart the way it broke mine when I first learned this story, let me ask you to do something simple. Drop a comment that says protect Lily, because the next part of this story shows how an entire community failed her. And I want to see how many of you refuse to look away. Let's keep going. That night, sleep refuses to come from Jack. He sits on the edge of Lily's bed. The room lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight, shaped like a little crescent moon. Lily lies on her back, staring at the ceiling as if answers might be hidden in the plaster. He keeps his voice gentle, steady, even though everything inside him feels like a tightening wire. How long? He asks. There is a long pause. Too long for a child who should never have had to measure silence like this. Finally, in a voice thin as paper, she says since the first week. 7 months. 7 months his daughter had been tormented while he made breakfast, packed her bag, told her to have a good day. 7 months of quiet suffering that he mistook for grief, or shyness, or the lingering weight of a move she never asked for. Why didn't you tell me, baby girl? His voice fractures on the question. Lily turns her head toward him. Her eyes shine with tears. But she doesn't let them fall because Mommy said you'd protect me, and I didn't want you to fight. I didn't want you to get in trouble. I didn't want to lose you too. The words hit him harder than anything Tyler Grant could deliver with fists. Guilt and love crashed together, swallowing him whole. His little girl, trying to protect him from her pain, thinking that asking for help might cost her the only parent she had left. He gathers her into his arms, holding her with a careful, desperate tenderness. You're never going to lose me, Lily. Never. But I need you to tell me everything, every single thing. Can you do that? She nods against his chest. And she does. What comes out next is not a story. It's a confession engraved by fear. Tyler Grant didn't just bully her. He curated her suffering. He called her orphan girl, biker trash, dirty boots, as though cruelty were a language he'd been raised in. He tripped her in hallways, knocked books from her arms, and once poured water onto her chair so she'd have no choice but to sit in humiliation. The lunch tray, that wasn't a one-time cruelty. It was his favorite act. He'd wait for her to sit down, then pass by with practice timing, sending food and dignity scattering across the floor. Lily learned to eat quickly in hidden corners, hoping he wouldn't find her that day. But what made Jack's blood turn cold wasn't Tyler. It was the adults. Lily had told teachers. She had told lunch monitors. She had told the school counselor. Every single time she received the same well-worn reassurances, cliches polished by years of complacency. Try to avoid him. Don't react and he'll stop. Boys will be boys. Each phrase another stone placed on her small shoulders. Jack feels something in him crack open. Not rage, something deeper, older. The sense of a promise trembling under unbearable weight. He asks the question that has begun forming like a shadow in his mind. Why didn't anyone help you? Lily hesitates, then says the name she has heard whispered among adults with a mixture of respect and fear. Because his dad is Mr. Grant, Victor Grant, school board member, local businessman, donor. Influence wrapped in a handshake and a checkbook. Jack sits back. The pieces click into place with sickening clarity. This isn't a case of a school not knowing. It's a case of a school deciding not to act. When Lily is finally asleep, her breathing soft and even, Jack steps into the hallway and closes the door behind him. He pulls out his phone, then another, then another. Parents first. Teachers he knows from pickups and fundraisers. The picture sharpens with each call. Tyler Grant has 12 documented complaints from students over 3 years. 12, and nothing meaningful ever happened. A detention here, a single suspension that lasted only a day. Some parents pushed harder, but their concerns were dismissed with lines about exaggeration or miscommunication. Teachers tried to intervene, but there were consequences for crossing the Grant family. One was suddenly reassigned. Another found themselves quietly removed from the after-school program that supplemented their income. A counselor who attempted to escalate an incident was told to consider whether she was misinterpreting normal developmental behavior. Victor Grant wasn't just on the board. He was the board. The superintendent owed him favors. The principal feared his influence. The staff knew better than to challenge the son of the man who signed their program budgets. Lily wasn't only confronting a bully. She was confronting a protected bully, shielded by a system that had long since decided whose children mattered and whose didn't. And in that moment, Jack understands something with perfect clarity. Going to the principal won't fix this. Filing a complaint won't fix this. Meeting with the school board won't fix this. The rot runs deeper than paperwork and polite conversations. If he wants justice, real justice, he cannot walk into this alone. He is going to need his brothers. Now, I know what you might be imagining. 200 desert vipers roaring up to a school, fists ready, chaos brewing. And maybe years ago, that's exactly what would have happened. But the brotherhood Jack belongs to has grown wiser. They've learned that true power isn't measured by destruction. It's measured by building something so undeniably righteous that those who oppose it crumble under their own shadows. What they are about to do to Oakwood won't involve a single punch, but it will shake that town to its foundation. 48 hours after finding his daughter on her knees in the school cafeteria, Jack Harlan drove down the long, cracked highway that led to the Ghost Trail Cafe. It was a place with peeling paint, neon that buzzed like a tired heartbeat, and parking spaces always filled with motorcycles lined up like loyal sentries. To most people, it looked like trouble waiting to happen. To Jack, it was home, the unofficial headquarters of the Desert Vipers New Mexico chapter, and the only place he knew he could go when a problem was too big for one man to shoulder alone. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, motor oil, and old stories. Rocco Bull Ramirez sat in his usual booth, a mountain of a man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen both violence and miracles. 20 years earlier, Bull had buried his own daughter after a drunk driver tore through his world. That grief lived behind his gaze, shaping the kind of leader he became. One who protected the vulnerable with the ferocity of someone who knew the price of loss. Jack approached, and Bull studied him for half a second before asking what happened. Jack told him everything. The cafeteria, the bullying, the teacher who stood by, the months his daughter suffered in silence, and finally, the name Tyler Grant. Bull's jaw tightened, his voice dropped into something rough and steady. "You sure you want to bring the club into this, brother?" "I don't want to," Jack said, "but I need to. The school board is protected. The bully's father runs half the town. If I go in alone, they'll bury this. They've been burying it for years." Bull didn't respond right away. He leaned back, weighing things the way only a man who has lived through tragedy can. Then he asked, "What exactly are you asking for?" There, in the middle of a cafe filled with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional metallic clink of cutlery, Jack let his guard fall. He didn't want fists. He didn't want threats. He wanted something larger, something impossible to ignore. Witnesses, the Desert Vipers, for all their reputation, were built on a code: loyalty, brotherhood, and the protection of the innocent. Outsiders misunderstood that code, seeing only leather and noise, never the community work, the charity rides, the nights spent mentoring kids whose lives had gone sideways. This chapter had changed. They'd grown. They'd softened in the right places and hardened in the ones that mattered. Jack wanted to use what the world believed about them, a mixture of fear and respect, not to intimidate, but to illuminate. "If 200 of us show up at that school board meeting," he said, "cameras will follow. Reporters will ask questions. Everything they've been hiding will have nowhere left to hide." Bull nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude. "You're not asking for war." "No," Jack answered. "I'm asking for justice." That night, Bull called an emergency meeting. Nearly 100 members gathered, men and women who had lived hard lives and rebuilt themselves piece by piece. Jack stood before them and told Lily's story. He told them about the kicked trays, the taunts, the bruises no one had cared to ask about. He told them about the teacher who watched and did nothing. He told them about the 12 documented complaints ignored by a system built to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. And then he spoke of Sarah, his wife, the promise he made to her, the promise he was on the verge of breaking if he didn't act now. There is a moment in every story, a single point where everything after shifts, where the tide turns because one choice is made with absolute conviction. When Jack finished speaking, that moment arrived. The vote was unanimous. 200 Desert Vipers would ride to Oakwood Elementary, not for violence, for visibility, for truth, for the kind of accountability that institutions fear because it demands honesty. But this wasn't going to be a mob descending on a school. It was going to be an operation. Bull began assigning roles with the precision of a general planning a mission. 3 members with law degrees would form a legal team, gathering and reviewing every piece of documentation they could find. A media liaison would reach out to local news stations, ensuring the narrative couldn't be twisted before the facts were clear. A logistics coordinator would oversee the demonstration, mapping routes, ensuring compliance with local laws, preventing even the appearance of aggression. And a select group would take on the most delicate job of all, speaking to other children and families, gathering testimonies from anyone else who had been silenced by fear or influence. This wasn't rage. This wasn't retaliation. This was strategy. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause for a moment. If you've made it this far, you're invested. You care about Lily. You want to see Tyler Grant held accountable. You want to see justice reach the adults who let this happen. Am I right? If I am, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next when 200 motorcycles roll up to that school at dawn is something I can promise you've never seen before. And trust me, you'll want to be here for it. Let's keep going. Jack woke before the sun, long before the world stirred. For in the morning, that hour when the air feels thin, when choices feel heavier, when a man can hear the echoes of his own heartbeat, he checked on Lily first. She was still asleep, curled beneath her blanket, unaware of the storm gathering on her behalf. Then he stepped out into the pale darkness and drove toward the staging area on the edge of town, a half-abandoned parking lot where the Desert Vipers often met before long rides. What he found there stopped him in his tracks. 200 motorcycles lined the asphalt, chrome catching the faintest hint of approaching dawn. But it wasn't the number that struck him. Worse, it was the people. Rocco Bull Ramirez stood at the front, broad, immovable, carrying the quiet gravity of a man who had once lost everything and vowed never to let another child fall through the cracks. Beside him was Maria Thread Lopez, still wearing her pediatric scrubs under her vest, having just finished an overnight shift. And there was David Sermon Hayes, a former pastor who had left the church but never abandoned the idea that his purpose was to serve others, even if he now served from behind handlebars instead of a pulpit. And beyond them, scores more men and women the outside world dismissed as outlaws, misfits, the dangerous sort. Yet here they were gathering before sunrise, not for a rally, not for intimidation, but for a 7-year-old girl whose name most of them had only learned the night before. People who had survived hard lives, but not allowed those lives to harden their hearts. This is what the world never sees. They see the leather, the tattoos, the engines that sound like storms being born. They don't see the nurse who works double shifts to pay for her mother's chemotherapy. They don't see the former pastor who still prays under his breath for strangers he passes on the road. They don't see the fathers and mothers who've made mistakes, paid for them, and now choose every day to stand between the innocent and the darkness. 200 flawed human beings, each one deciding on this morning to be a shield for a child they had never met. At exactly 6, Bull raised his hand. 200 engines roared to life. The sound rolled through the open land like thunder caught in a metal cage. It rattled windows miles away. It vibrated through the bones of the people who heard it. Dogs barked. Lights flicked on in neighborhood houses. The formation pulled out in disciplined rows. Tight, smooth, practiced from years of riding together. Jack rode beside Bull at the front, the two of them leading a river of chrome and leather stretching half a mile behind them. People emerged from diners, gas stations, and front porches as the procession moved through town. Some waved, others simply stared, phones held high to record the sight. A few looked uneasy, unable to reconcile the intimidating spectacle with the quiet purpose behind it. But most sensed what was happening, something that wasn't about fear, but about resolve. By 6:45, the procession arrived at Oakwood Elementary, and they did not surround it. They did not block entrances. They parked one by one in the overflow lot across the street. Engines died until only silence remained. 200 bikers stood there, not moving, not shouting, simply present, standing, waiting, watching. Inside the school, panic erupted instantly. Principal Laura Hayes glanced out her office window, saw the sea of motorcycles, and turned pale. She fumbled for the phone and called the police. "There's a gang outside," she blurted. "Hundreds of them. I need officers here now." 4 squad cars arrived within minutes, lights flashing in the dawn. Sheriff Daniel Ruiz stepped out, hand resting near his belt, eyes taking in the scene with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He expected a confrontation. Instead, he found order. Quiet. Not a single weapon visible. Not a single law being broken. Bull walked forward slowly, hands clearly shown. "Sheriff Ruiz," he said, voice deep but calm. "My name is Rocco Ramirez. We're here to attend the emergency school board meeting this afternoon. Until then, we'll be waiting here peacefully to ensure the safety of the children as they arrive, particularly one child, Lily Harlan." The sheriff studied him. "You planning on causing trouble?" "No, sir," Bull replied. "But we're planning on shining a light on the trouble that's already here." Sheriff Ruiz didn't know it yet, but that light was about to burn hotter than anyone expected. While 200 bikers kept quiet watch, 3 Desert Vipers with law degrees were already inside the county records office, pulling documents the school hoped no one would ever see. And what they found would turn this from a bullying complaint into a full-blown scandal. But that comes later. First, we need to talk about what happened when Lily arrived at school. Lily woke to a silence so unfamiliar that for a moment, she thought she'd overslept. Most mornings began with the soft rumble of her father's motorcycle pulling away from the house, the sound fading into distance as he headed to the cafe. But today, the house was still. She padded into the kitchen and found Jack already dressed, leaning against the counter as though waiting for her. "Daddy, aren't you going to work?" "Not today, baby girl," he said gently. "Today I'm taking you to school myself." It was a small sentence, but it landed with a weight she didn't yet understand. For months, she'd grown used to moving through mornings with dread sitting heavily on her chest. Today, that dread loosened its grip. Her father's jaw was set, his posture steady. His eyes, tired, yes, but watchful, held a certainty she hadn't seen since before her mother died. On the drive, Lily held her backpack tightly to her chest. She still didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it. Something had shifted when they turned the corner toward Oakwood Elementary. She saw them. The motorcycles, the rows of leather vests, the unmistakable silhouettes of riders standing like a silent wall of protection. "Daddy, is that Jack nodded?" "Those are my brothers, sweetheart. And my sisters, they're here to make sure you're safe." When they parked, Jack took her hand and walked her towards the front doors. And then something happened that would etch itself into her memory for the rest of her life. As she passed each biker, they straightened, not with intimidation, but with honor. Some nodded in quiet respect. Others pressed a hand to their hearts. Maria Thread Lopez stepped forward, dropped to a knee so she was eye level with Lily, and smiled gently. "You must be Lily," she said. "I'm Thread. I'm a nurse, and I want you to know something. You are brave. What you've been going through would break most grown-ups, but you're still standing. That makes you one of us." She placed a small pin in Lily's hand. A guardian angel with tiny wings warm from Thread's palm. "Wear this today, and whenever you're scared, remember you've got 200 people out here who've got your back." Lily pinned it to her sweater. And when she walked into school, her shoulders were no longer curled inward. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Within minutes, whispers rippled through the hallways. Teachers peeked through blinds. Students exchanged wide-eyed looks. For 5 long months, Lily had been invisible except to those who hurt her. Now she was unmistakably seen. And in that visibility, something else happened. Other children began to step forward. By second period, 3 students approached her carefully. "Is it true?" one whispered. "All those bikers, they're here for you. They're here for anyone who needs them," Lily said, repeating her father's words. By lunchtime, 6 more kids had come to her. They too had stories. Tyler Grant had tormented 6 children. And he wasn't alone. Oakwood had a culture of cruelty that thrived in silence, protected by adults who chose convenience over courage. Let's pause and talk about Tyler Grant. Because understanding a villain means understanding the soil he grew from. Tyler wasn't born cruel. He was taught. He came from a home where influence rewrote consequences. His father sat on the school board. His mother chaired the PTA. Donations shielded him. Phone calls erased complaints. Teachers who challenged him found themselves reassigned or reprimanded. Tyler learned early and thoroughly that rules were for other people. And then there was Mrs. Karen Ellis, the teacher who watched Lily's humiliation and chose stillness. Years earlier, she had tried to report a Grant-related incident. 2 weeks later, she was stripped of her classroom and reassigned to cafeteria duty. The message was clear. Protecting children carried a price. Her fear doesn't excuse her failure. A child suffered in front of her, and she looked away. But her story proved something crucial. This wasn't one bad actor. This was a system built to punish the brave and protect the powerful. And that system was about to collide with 200 people who could not be intimidated. People who had nothing to lose and every reason to demand the truth. While the bikers stood in quiet formation outside Oakwood Elementary, their engines silent, but their presence unmistakable, another operation unfolded behind the scenes, one far less visible, but far more devastating. 3 members of the Desert Vipers, each with a law degree and years of courtroom experience, had spent the day combing through public records at the county office. They weren't looking for rumors or hearsay. They were hunting for patterns, for omissions, for the fingerprints of institutional neglect. At 2 that afternoon, they returned to the overflow lot where Bull and Jack waited. Their expressions said everything before a single word was spoken. What they found was bigger, much bigger than a single child being tormented by a protected bully. Victor Grant hadn't just shielded his son. He had been using his school board position as a kind of quiet fortress, protecting the children of donors and influential families while leaving the vulnerable completely exposed. 14 separate incident reports involving children of major benefactors have been dismissed outright. 2 teachers who tried to report these incidents were quietly terminated under the vague banner of performance issues. And perhaps most damning of all, a clear pattern emerged in the digital logs. Complaints disappearing, sealed without proper notes, or simply deleted altogether. This wasn't negligence, it was orchestration. The system wasn't merely failing children, it had been engineered to fail them. For Jack, the revelation felt like the ground shifting beneath him. Lily wasn't the first. She wasn't the only one. She was simply the one whose suffering collided with a father who refused to accept silence as an answer. And now, armed with evidence instead of rage, the Desert Vipers had the leverage they needed to expose a decade of buried harm. By 3/4, the story had begun spilling beyond the schoolyard. 3 local news stations arrived, cameras and microphones ready, drawn by the extraordinary sight. 200 bikers standing peacefully outside an elementary school. To some, it looked like a standoff. To others, a mystery. But to the people gathered there, it was the beginning of truth rising to the surface. Sofia Link Vargas, the chapter's media liaison and a former journalist, stepped forward before any narrative could be twisted into sensationalism. She did not posture. She did not deliver threats. Instead, she handed reporters a meticulously organized packet. Inside were the facts, documented complaints, the sealed files, the statements from silenced teachers, and the accounts gathered from children who had been too afraid to speak until now. Sofia knew the nature of news cycles. Outrage burns bright and fast, but documentation, cold, clear, undeniable, endures. It forces reckoning. It rewrites narratives. By the time the 5 Kosa News aired, the headlines had changed. It was no longer about a biker gang gathering outside a school. It was about a grassroots investigation that had exposed nearly a decade of systemic bullying, cover-ups, and abuses of power at Oakwood Elementary. The cameras showed leather vests, yes, but they also showed binders of evidence, statements from parents, and the faces of children who finally felt seen. Before we move forward, let me ask you something. How many adults do you think witnessed the cruelty at Oakwood, the bullying, the dismissals, the way power insulated itself and chose silence? How many of us in our own lives look away because speaking up feels risky? If you've ever stayed silent when you knew something was wrong, say so in the comments. It takes courage to admit that, but it takes even more courage to choose differently the next time. Now, with evidence in hand and the public watching, it's time to see what happened when the school board was forced to face the truth. By 6:00 that evening, the tiny Oakwood school boardroom meant to seat 50 felt like the eye of an oncoming storm. 300 people pushed into the hallways, filled the doorways, spilled out onto the sidewalk. Parents, teachers, students, reporters, and 200 desert vipers standing shoulder to shoulder in their clean shirts, polished boots, and leather vests. They hadn't come to intimidate. They'd come to witness, to speak, to make sure the truth could no longer be buried under paperwork and influence. Victor Grant sat at the center of the board table, jaw clenched tight, knuckles pale where his hands gripped the edge. He had expected anger, perhaps a few parents raising their voices, perhaps some uncomfortable questions. He had not expected a community rising in unison. He had not expected 200 bikers standing silently in support of the children. His system had failed. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence thinning by the minute. The meeting opened with procedural language, community concerns, safety protocols, recent events. But the air in the room pulsed with something far more human, far more urgent. And then the testimonies began. A mother stood first. Her voice cracked as she described how her son had been shoved into lockers for months, how she had filed reports that mysteriously disappeared, how she had been told to give it time. Another parent followed, and another. Years of ignored pleas poured into the room like water flooding a broken dam. There were tears, trembling hands, the shaking breath of people who had carried their children's hurt in silence. Then came the students. A 12-year-old boy named Diego stepped up to the microphone, glasses repaired with tape after Tyler Grant snapped them in half. He told the board how Tyler had called him slurs, how the counselor had suggested he consider whether he was doing something to provoke it. His voice wavered, but he did not back down. The room held its breath for him. Next came 2 former teachers invited by the Desert Vipers legal team. They testified to things the district hoped would never resurface: pressure to modify grades for the children of donors, warnings not to discipline certain students, sudden terminations after they refused to play along. Their words were steady but heavy, the kind that leave a mark. And then Jack Harlan rose. He stood without theatrics, without raising his voice. But the room stilled, as if every person there knew something essential was about to be said. "My wife made me promise to protect our daughter," Jack began. "I thought that meant keeping her fed, keeping a roof over her head, teaching her right from wrong. I didn't realize it would mean fighting an entire system that had decided she wasn't worth protecting." He paused, letting the truth settle like dust across the room. "My daughter spent 7 months eating her lunch off the floor because a boy 3 years older than her thought it was funny. And the adults who were supposed to protect her, the teacher, the counselor, the principal, this board, you looked the other way. Some of you are angry we're here. You think this is intimidation, but let me tell you something. Intimidation is what my 7-year-old felt every single morning walking into your school. We're not here to intimidate. We're here to say it stops tonight." When he finished, the silence was so complete it felt physical. Victor Grant leaned into his microphone. His tone was icy, controlled. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "I understand you're upset, but bringing a motorcycle gang to a school board meeting is hardly the appropriate way to address concerns." "If you had followed proper channels," Jack cut in, voice calm, but unwavering. "We have documentation of 12 children following proper channels with your son, Mr. Grant. Every single time, those channels led nowhere. I wonder why." The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition. It was the moment a community realized the truth had finally been spoken aloud. What happened next would change Oakwood forever. But the real shift didn't begin in that boardroom. It began in the hours that followed, when the news spread beyond town lines. When state officials began making calls, and when 3 board members quietly announced they were stepping back to spend more time with family, the dominoes had started to fall, and Jack Harlan was about to watch the promise he made to his wife finally take root. Over the next 72 hours, Oakwood found itself thrust into a reckoning no one in the district had imagined possible. A story that began with a single humiliated child now unfolded across television screens, news feeds, and dinner table conversations nationwide. The footage of 200 bikers fictionally portrayed here as members of a reformed motorcycle brotherhood standing silently outside an elementary school spread with astonishing speed. People who had never heard of Oakwood before watched the scene in disbelief. Not a protest fueled by anger, not a confrontation marked by threats, but a peaceful stand taken on behalf of a 7-year-old girl who had slipped through the cracks of the very system meant to protect her. The country reacted. The stereotype of bikers as inherently dangerous clashed with images of grown men and women kneeling to give a guardian angel pin to a frightened child. Narratives cracked open, assumptions shattered, and alongside that shift, the public's trust in the Oakwood school system crumbled. The meticulously organized documentation handed to reporters sealed complaints, erased records, testimonies that were ignored for years, painted a picture of corruption so systematic it was impossible to dismiss. Justice, slow at first, began to gather momentum. Within hours, state education officials announced a formal investigation. The school board scrambled, calling an emergency closed session. Though behind those closed doors, panic outweighed strategy. Victor Grant, the man at the center of it all, hired a crisis management firm in a frantic attempt to salvage his reputation. But the move only deepened public suspicion. A man confident in his innocence seeks truth. A man afraid of exposure hires consultants. By Friday, exactly 1 week after Jack Harlan had walked into that cafeteria and seen his daughter kneeling on the floor, consequences began to take shape. Mrs. Karen Ellis, the cafeteria supervisor who stood and watched multiple incidents without intervening, was terminated. Documentation revealed she had witnessed at least 3 separate episodes involving Tyler Grant and failed to act or report any of them. Superintendent Robert Klein resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons, though an audit soon uncovered that he had knowingly approved the sealing of 7 complaint files involving donors' children. 3 school board members, including Victor Grant himself, resigned to avoid formal ethics investigations, and for the first time in his young life, Tyler Grant faced real accountability. He was suspended indefinitely, enrolled in mandatory counseling, and barred from unsupervised areas and extracurricular activities. Notice something important. None of these consequences came from violence. Not one came from intimidation or threats. They came from truth, documented, organized, and presented in a way no one could ignore. The motorcycle brotherhood in this fictional story hadn't laid a hand on anyone. They hadn't cornered or coerced. They simply refused to let the darkness remain hidden. But justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning. The following weekend, the bikers returned to Oakwood Elementary, not to protest, not to pressure, but to give back. They brought a check for $42,000 raised from fictional chapters across New Mexico. It was money meant not to erase the past, but to rebuild something better for the children still living in its shadow. The funds covered free breakfast and lunch for every student for the rest of the school year. They paid for new cafeteria seating, bright lighting, and repairs that had been neglected for years. And perhaps most importantly, they funded the development of a comprehensive anti-bullying program created with the help of child psychologists. But their work reached even further. They established Viper's Guard, a volunteer initiative in which vetted members took turns supervising morning drop-offs and afternoon pickups. Their presence became a quiet but powerful deterrent, visible enough to inspire confidence, steady enough to reassure children who had learned not to trust the adults around them. The transformation was profound. A week earlier, Oakwood had been defined by secrecy, fear, and silence. Now it began to hum with something entirely different: accountability, protection, a sense of community long overdue. And here's the part worth lingering on. Remember when this story began, the expectation it challenged? Many assumed that if 200 bikers showed up at a school, chaos would follow. Violence, intimidation, the worst stereotypes playing out in predictable fashion. But that's not what happened. Instead of destruction, they chose restoration. Instead of retaliation, they chose responsibility. They arrived ready to fight for a child, but discovered the strongest weapon they had was their ability to build, to support, to shine light where others had drawn curtains. This story didn't unfold the way anyone predicted. And that is precisely why it matters. Anyone can break something. Anyone can make noise, raise fists, or leave damage behind. But it takes real strength to rebuild what others have neglected. It takes courage to stand in the open, to expose the truth, to insist that children deserve safety, dignity, and the attention of the adults entrusted with their care. And when 200 people made that choice, Oakwood changed, its children changed, and perhaps in some small but meaningful way, the wider world watching changed too. Because if they could do that, if people labeled as outcasts, rebels, or troublemakers could be protectors instead, then the question becomes something personal. If they could choose healing over vengeance, what could I do? What could you do? 2 weeks after the confrontation that shook Oakwood to its core, Lily returned to school. Not as the frightened, shrinking child who once slipped through hallways like a shadow, but as someone who finally understood what it meant to be protected. Healing hadn't erased what happened, but it had softened the edges of her fear. She walked through the front doors of Oakwood Elementary with her father beside her. The guardian angel pin still fastened to her sweater. Its wings caught the morning light, small but unmistakably present, a symbol not of defiance, but of belonging. The change was immediate. Children who once passed her without noticing now waved. A girl from her class offered her a shy smile. Even a teacher she had never spoken to before stopped and crouched to her level, asking, "How are you doing today, sweetheart?" For the first time in months, Lily didn't feel the need to look at the floor. She lifted her head and answered softly, "I'm okay." And she was not untouched, but supported. And that made all the difference. When lunchtime arrived, she did something that would have felt impossible only weeks earlier. She walked into the cafeteria and chose a table near the center of the room, not the corner near the emergency exit where she had once hidden, trying to make herself invisible. Today, she sat where anyone could see her, where everyone could see her. She opened her lunch slowly, not rushing, not bracing for a kick or a cruel laugh. 3 students approached. 1 girl, 2 boys. They didn't look nervous this time. They looked hopeful. "Can we sit with you?" one asked. Lily nodded. She didn't have to force a smile. It came naturally, a quiet bloom of warmth in her chest. As they ate, the conversation was simple, gentle, nothing extraordinary. But for Lily, it felt monumental. This wasn't pity. It wasn't sympathy. It was connection. Real human connection. The kind she had been starved of for months. And as she listened to them talk about homework and pets and weekend plans, something loosened inside her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like a child again. Healing rarely announces itself with fanfare. It happens in small shifts, in the way shoulders start to relax, in the way breathing feels less tight, in the way a child chooses a seat in the middle of a room instead of hiding in the shadows. Lily's healing began that day, one moment at a time. That evening, after dinner, dishes were washed and the sun had begun melting into the horizon. Jack and Lily settled onto their porch swing. The New Mexico sky was streaked with colors so vivid they almost looked painted. Deep orange, dusty rose, and a fading purple that signaled the night's slow approach. Somewhere far off, a motorcycle engine rumbled, faint, familiar, comforting. Lily leaned against her father's side, swinging gently. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't heavy or strained. It was peaceful, something they both needed more than they knew. Then Lily said softly, "Daddy?" "Yeah, baby girl. Are we safe here now?" Jack wrapped an arm around her and held her close. That simple question carried every ounce of fear, exhaustion, and longing she had carried in silence for months. He felt it settle into him like a stone. He thought about everything that had happened, the panic, the rage he'd had to swallow, the community that rose beside him, the moment the truth finally broke through years of neglect. He thought about 200 people standing in the cold for a child they'd never met, simply because doing nothing was no longer an option. "We're safe," he said gently. "Nobody's going to hurt you again. Not while I'm alive. Not while my brothers and sisters ride with me." Lily let her head rest fully on his side, trusting him in a way she had been too scared to trust anyone for far too long. For a moment, Jack thought the night might end on that note. A quiet closeness, a breath shared between father and daughter. But then she spoke again, even quieter than before. "I miss Mommy." The word struck him in a place beyond language. Grief, after all, never truly leaves. It simply finds quieter ways to sit beside you. His throat tightened, his voice nearly failing as he answered. "Me too, baby girl. Every single day." Lily lifted her gaze toward the emerging stars. "Do you think she saw what happened?" Jack followed her eyes to the sky. The first stars flickered through the fading light, distant and steady. He took a long breath, letting it fill him. "I think," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I think she always knew you had an army. She just didn't know it would be wearing leather." Lily pressed closer, a soft, contented sigh escaping her. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. The swing continued its slow, rhythmic creaking, moving back and forth like the heartbeat of a home finally healing. And for the first time since Sarah's passing, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over them. Fragile, but real. His daughter was safe. She was seen. She was surrounded by people who would not allow her to disappear into silence again. In that moment, under a sky scattered with stars, Lily Harlan, once a child trembling over a scattered lunch tray, finally felt protected enough to simply be a child again. A year passed, and Oakwood Elementary was no longer the school it had once been. The hallways felt lighter, not because children had forgotten what happened, but because the adults in charge finally understood their responsibility and lived up to it. Bullying reports dropped by 78%, not due to silence or fear, but because complaints were taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and addressed with real consequences. For the first time in years, students felt safe raising their voices. And when they did, someone finally listened. The Viper's Guard program, born from a moment of crisis, became something far greater than anyone expected. Its rotating group of vetted volunteers became a daily presence, a reassurance to children who once walked into school with dread. Other New Mexico districts took notice. Soon, 3 of them began studying Oakwood's model, hoping to replicate the sudden and dramatic shift in school culture. The transformation of Oakwood became a quiet beacon, proof that community action could accomplish what bureaucracy had repeatedly failed to do. As for the people at the heart of the storm, their paths diverged. After intensive counseling and a transfer to a smaller private school, Tyler Grant began confronting the consequences he had been shielded from his entire life. At 15, he wrote a letter unprompted to Lily. It wasn't eloquent, but it was sincere. An apology shaped not by his parents' influence, but by the weight of accountability he finally felt. Victor Grant, stripped of his position and his reputation, sold his business and moved out of state. He never again held a public office. His departure was quiet, almost invisible, but Oakwood felt the absence of his shadow immediately. Teachers began teaching without fear. Administrators began enforcing rules without checking donor lists first. Mrs. Ellis found employment at a private company. Whether she carried forward the lesson of her silence, no one could say. Some wounds are invisible, and some transformations are private. But in Oakwood, her name became a reminder of what happens when fear wins over courage. And Jack Harlan, who once walked into a cafeteria and saw his daughter on her knees, continued running diners with his chapter. But on the first Monday of every month, without fail, he drove to Oakwood Elementary, signed in at the front office, and sat cross-legged among first graders to read them stories. He never missed a month, not once. Some of the students knew him as the man with the leather vest and the soft voice. Others knew him simply as Mr. Harlan, the reading guy. For Jack, it wasn't duty. It was a promise, one he had made long before the town discovered who he was. And Lily. She turned 9. Her world had expanded again, this time in all the right ways. She played softball, laughing when she missed a catch, cheering when someone else made one. She had 3 best friends who filled her days with jokes, whispered secrets, and the kind of uncomplicated joy that had once seemed out of reach. She kept the guardian angel pin in a little box on her dresser and wore it on special days. Picture day, her birthday. The first day of school, when she wanted to feel close to the people who had stood for her. One afternoon, a new student arrived. A shy boy from Arizona who sat alone at lunch, shoulders hunched the way hers once had been. Lily spotted him instantly. She walked over, set her tray down beside him, and said in a gentle voice that held more understanding than most adults could muster, "I'm Lily. Want to sit with us? It can be scary here at first, but you're not alone." The boy hesitated, then nodded. And just like that, the cycle turned. pain transformed into protection, fear into kindness, silence into welcome. In that small moment, Lily became what she once needed most. The boy said yes. In the end, after all the noise had settled, after the headlines faded and Oakwood returned to the rhythm of ordinary days, there remained one final question. The one every story must eventually ask. What does it all mean? Because this wasn't only the tale of a father and his daughter. It wasn't just about corruption being exposed or a community rising to confront its own failures. No, beneath every moment, beneath every decision Jack Harlan made, there lived a deeper truth about courage, about responsibility, and about the cost of silence. Here's what I want you to take from this story. Jack could have done exactly what the world expected him to do. He could have stormed into that cafeteria, fists clenched, throat roaring with fury. He could have confronted the boy, threatened the teacher, demanded answers from the principal. He could have let anger be his weapon, and no one who knew his grief would have blamed him for it. But what would that have changed? He would have been arrested. Lily would have been further traumatized. The school would have dismissed him as another violent biker, not a grieving father fighting for justice. And the system that failed her would have remained intact, untouched, unchallenged. Instead, he made a different choice, a harder choice. He gathered his brothers, not to intimidate, but to testify. He gathered evidence, not excuses. He brought cameras, not crowbars. He exposed lies with truth, not fear. He took a system built to protect the powerful and turned its own rules inward, forcing it to examine what it had allowed, what it had enabled, what it had ignored. And in doing so, he didn't just protect his daughter. He protected every child who had been told to just ignore it. Every parent who had been dismissed, every teacher who had been pressured into silence. That is the real power here. Not the motorcycles, not the leather, not the image the world had assigned to men like him. The real power was the willingness to drag injustice into the light and refuse to let it hide again. The courage to stand in truth, even when it meant being misunderstood. The strength to fight gently, loudly, relentlessly, without throwing a single punch. Lily's story ended well for one reason. Someone stood up. Someone said enough. Someone was willing to be uncomfortable, willing to be judged, willing to be talked about and doubted and criticized. Also, a 7-year-old girl would never again crouch on a cold cafeteria floor, picking her lunch off the tiles while adults pretended not to see. And here's the part that should stay with you long after this story ends. There are Lily everywhere. Kids in your neighborhood, kids at your church, kids in your extended family, children who walk into school each morning carrying fears they never speak aloud, children convinced that no one will believe them, that no one will help, that no one cares enough to step into the mess on their behalf. They are quieter than Lily, or louder, or better at hiding their pain. But they exist in every town, every classroom, every community. And the truth is, you don't need 200 motorcycles to change their story. You don't need leather jackets or roaring engines or a brotherhood standing behind you. You just need to pay attention to listen when a child hesitates before speaking. To notice when someone grows smaller day by day. To ask the uncomfortable questions. To believe them the first time they tell you something is wrong. To care enough to intervene, even if your voice shakes, even if others roll their eyes, even if taking action makes you the difficult one, because that's how the world changes, not with grand gestures or viral moments, but with ordinary people refusing to stay silent, with adults choosing discomfort over complicity, with communities remembering that their first duty is to protect the vulnerable, the frightened, the small. If we paid attention, really paid attention, stories like Lily's wouldn't happen in the first place. And now, before you go, there's something I want to ask you. Something simple but deeply important. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something in your chest, if it reminded you of your own past, if it made you think differently about what it means to stand up, then I want to hear from you. Tell me who your protector was, who stepped between you and the hurt when you needed it most. And if no one did, if you had to weather the storm alone, tell me what you wish someone had done. Tell me what would have made you feel safe. And if you believe children like Lily deserve protection. If you believe bullies and the adults who enable them should never win, then I'm inviting you to stay. Subscribe, comment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because I'm going to keep telling stories like this. Stories about ordinary people choosing courage when silence would have been easier. Stories about justice born not from fists but from community. Stories about what happens when the overlooked are finally seen. One like, one comment, one share. That's you saying, I stand with Lily. I stand against cruelty. I stand for the children who can't stand for themselves. And I hope you do. I'll see you in the next